So, in practice, in most of the problems that we're going to be dealing with in this course, the distinction between these different problems and so forth is not going to be that important to most of the issues we'll bring up, but they're good things to be aware of in case an issue related to them comes up in one of the contexts. Okay, so another problem arises from conflicts among shareholders. So one conflict can be between profits and other goals. So some shareholders may believe in corporate social responsibility and want the company to do corporate, socially responsible investing rather than profit maximization. And that might sound squishy and nice, but there's other cases where shareholders have other goals that maybe don't sound so squishy and nice. So for example, there was a major issue during the Jim Crow era in the United States that companies would, people would only invest in companies that didn't employ any black people, right? So goals that are not related to profits can go in many different directions. Now, a common response to this is that firms should just maximize profits, and then, once the shareholders get their money back, they can spend that on whatever other goals they have. Yeah, Mohammed.
What if most of the shareholders have the same opinion, so like there's a voting process, and they want to spend it in the company rather than taking the money out because they get a lot of tax benefits? So is this ethical?
Well, I think that is an interesting issue. I think an even more important issue than that is when there's complementarities between what the company does and the non-profit related motive they have. So for example, Bell Telephone Company created Bell Labs, and I think a lot of people thought that that was better than them just making more profits and then people spending it on charitable things for social research, because there was a lot of complementarities between engineering at Bell Labs and evaluating engineers at Bell Labs and having all these scientists around. So that's, I think, the most compelling case for CSR, is when they're highly complementary with other things the firms are doing. When it's totally unrelated, which is often the case with CSR, there's a much less compelling case, I think. Yeah, what's your name?
Dan.
Dan.
Well, couldn't you still just argue that they could do that with their own money, like give it to Bell, and like with the earmark that it has to be used for some sort of research, and you would still get the complementary effect?
Would that work? My guess is that would be more cumbersome in many cases, but I don't think that I see any fundamental reason why that couldn't happen. It might be harder for them to monitor, because you'd have to set up a separate monitoring organization, But no, I mean, there's some truth to that. So different perspectives on risk among shareholders can be another source of conflict. Chrissy, could you explain why that might be a source of conflict for a firm? Like if consumers have different investors have different risk aversion?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're putting up the capital for somebody else to manage, and say you're more risk averse, but you want a consistent return, you may want your manager to.
Well, that's true for the managers versus the shareholders, but what about within different shareholders?
Oh, well, that's the problem as well. If you have like small shareholders versus the large shareholders, then if they all have like different opinions, you just basically get the average across them maybe, or some people carry more clout for their risk attitude.
Or not the right average, or I mean, it all depends on how the voting works and so forth. I mean, another issue that's probably even more severe than that is not only does this depend on your risk aversion, but on what are the risks you face in your life. So if you're a steel worker and you have a share of the, a company, you probably don't want to be investing in the steel industry because that'll expose you to more risk in the worst states of the world for you. But on the other hand, if you're a steel purchaser, then actually if the steel industry is not doing so well, that could actually be good for you because the prices might be low or something. I mean, so yeah. Okay, classes of shareholders is another issue. So not all shareholders, preferred and common equity, have necessarily the same interests. Probably the worst problem comes when there are a few large shareholders. Is Mark Brown here? No. So does anyone else have a thought of why like a large shareholder might be a problem for a corporation? What's your name back there?
Eric.
Eric.
Well, rather than trying to maximize the profits of the firm itself, a large shareholder might use it to maximize their own personal welfare. Like if they have money invested in other companies and other industries, they might steer that company towards assisting their other investments rather than maximizing their own profit.
Yeah, that's a good example. Is anyone here from the former Soviet Union? No? Okay. So a particularly egregious example of this happened in like Russia right after the fall of the Soviet Union. So what would happen is that there was like no protections for minority shareholders, and so people would buy up 51% of a company, and then they would tell the company to sell all of its assets at zero price to another company that they owned 100% of, and therefore they would basically just completely expropriate the remaining 49% of the shareholders, right? So some imperfect solutions to this, as I just pointed out, are voting, but it's obviously imperfect because it doesn't really efficiently make decisions. It allows for this sort of thing. Another thing is that if the company is not really being run in the interest of its shareholders, it may be possible to buy out all the shareholders, and as the person who takes control of it, take over the company and run it in the interests of the company as a whole. Okay, so managers, as Christy was pointing out, also have their own interests in mind rather than the company's interests. And they employ themselves sub-managers who have their own interests in mind, not the interests of the higher level managers in mind. And those managers hire foremen who have the interests of the foremen and not the interests of the managers in mind. And they hire employees who have the employees' interests in mind. And da-da-da. It's turtles all the way down. Do you guys know the story of turtles all the way down? So there's this like famous sage, and somebody comes to him and says, the earth, why doesn't it just fall out of the sky? And they say, well, it's sitting on top of a turtle. And he says, oh, but what's the turtle on top of? And he says, well, the turtle's on top of another turtle, right? And then he says, but what's that turtle's doing? He says, lady, it's turtles all the way down, right? So, so that's sort of how the principal agent problems in a corporation are, right? And this leads to all sorts of suboptimal behavior, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But what would be the ideal situation? Is Scott Mendelson here? No? Does anyone want to say why it would be the ideal thing for the manager of the firm to also be its owner? Yeah, go ahead, Mohammed.
So there is no moral hazard problem because the interests are aligned.
Yeah.
He's the owner. He cares about the profits.
Yeah.
And he knows how to gain them. So.
Exactly. Yeah. So the problem is this ideal situation is usually impossible because some people have money and other people actually have the ideas or the talent to run a company. Now, in principle, you could solve that by making the person who didn't have the money still what's called the residual claimant. And the way you could do that is by saying, okay, well, you don't have the money to start the company. I'll give you the money, but let's set up a system where if the company does badly, I'll throw you in jail or maybe torture you or kill you or something like that. And that's sort of like how the mafia often works, right? And we may all say, oh, it's so great that we have laws against that sort of thing. And in fact, it's not such an efficient system because people don't really want that if something randomly happens and the company doesn't do so well that they get killed. But on the other hand, in countries where you don't have enough protections to make sure that managers act in the interests of the owners, and those could include things like this, you often see that there's a ton of nepotism, right? Because everyone's afraid that if they give money to anyone and that person doesn't act in their interest, maybe for corporate social responsibility or any other reason, then they just want to give money to people within their families because they can trust them, right? And so when you see sort of old boys networks, people only working with people from their college, people only working with friends, you can often attribute a lot of that to the lack of good corporate governance institutions in a country. So as much as corporate governance and shareholder value, people don't necessarily view as such great things because they think that it leads to rapacious pursuit of profits. the thing that they forget is that otherwise you end up in one of these nepotistic situations where people only want to employ people who have a personal relationship with them because they're the only ones they can trust. Okay. Now, principal agent problems are a very general problem that come up all over economics, and we'll return to them lots of times during the course, but I want to give a little warm-up right now. Okay, so I'm now going to go through a bunch of incentives that firms use to get people to work harder, and or to work in the interests of the firm. Some of these are things that economists love and talk about all the time. Some of them sound squishy, and economists don't like to talk about them. But they're all things that are supplied by the market that we see being used all the time, and so are important to understand. So one of these is equity in the company, or stock options, or other financial instruments. These are what economists love talking about. They love talking about how great these are at giving people incentives. Another thing that's slightly less familiar but still quite similar is vesting. So you can have options that you're not allowed to sell for a certain period of time, or the ability that you can take this money, but then we can take it back from you if something bad happens in the future. Another thing that's used a lot, you see this especially in low-level and menial labor jobs, is direct management or monitoring. People at McDonald's don't have equity stakes or whatever, but someone's constantly on their back making sure that they're working hard, right? A fourth thing is lawsuits or auditing people for misbehavior. So, this happens a lot when there's accounting frauds. You'll come in and do an audit, you'll find a problem, and the person will get sued. A fifth thing is what's called efficiency wages, or issues about career concerns. So there, what you'll do is you'll pay someone a lot more than they're really worth, just to make them insecure about losing their job, so that they're going to be constantly working hard because they don't want to lose this really great position, right? Another thing is bonuses. So bonuses are sort of like material incentives, but they're often based on an evaluation, not of the overall performance of a company and what it's worth, but on how that person did on a particular task. Either based on hard information, some measurement of how well they did, how many sales they made, or based on a soft information, just their manager's evaluation of how well they did. Now we're going to start to get into more squishy things that maybe economists aren't so comfortable with. So one, maybe still sort of okay, is reputation and external career concerns. So I might want to do a good job because I'm afraid that I'll get a reputation for being lazy, and then no one will ever want to hire me in the future. Another thing that's starting to get even squishier is that people can often be incentivized by giving them a sense that what it means for them to be a successful person in life is to do a good job in this profession. So this is sort of what I was saying about the prostitute story yesterday, Tuesday, that I told. That prostitute came to think that this was what made her a powerful person in the world. So she wanted to maybe do a good job in her job because it made her feel like she was really important. And professionalism can do that as well. So doctors get the sense that what it means to be a good, successful person for them is to provide good care to their patients. Corporate cultures, when people talk about that, are usually about this. It's about instilling a sense that this company, what we do around here, the sort of people we are, is the people who do whatever, right? Leadership can be very powerful in achieving those and other things. So a great leader can really inspire people to do great work because they want to impress that person, or they can scare people. So people can just have this feeling that this person's going to get me even if they're not actually going to. And that's another effective way sometimes of inspiring or getting people to work harder. Pressure can work as well. So peer pressure, these feelings of culture and so forth can lead people to be constantly watching each other. And if you don't think that's an effective means of control, look at Nazi Germany, right? Another opposite sort of to that is intrinsic motivation. And if you don't